Hello everyone, it's Blake here with ChessPathways.com, and today we're going to be talking about the Benko Gambit. The Benko Gambit actually starts out as a Benoni defense, so white's going to play d4, we have the queen's pawn opening, knight to f6, c4, c5, white plays the most popular move here, d5. Now in the Benoni defense, black's usually going to play e6 or e5 here, challenging white's space advantage in the center. And I'll go ahead and put a link to my video on the Benoni defense down in the description if you're interested in that. But the Benko Gambit is black playing this interesting pawn sacrifice here, pawn to b5. The Benko Gambit's interesting because, unlike a lot of other gambits, black's not sacrificing a pawn to get a big attack here. Black's really sacrificing this pawn purely for positional reasons. So let's go ahead and look at what happens if white accepts this gambit. If white plays c takes b5, black will usually continue with a6, offering another pawn, and after b takes a6, black doesn't have to recapture this pawn right away. It's definitely going to be easy to recapture later. Black usually continues their development and plays pawn to g6, preparing to fianchetto this bishop. So what's going on here? Black's going to be down a pawn even after they win this pawn back, and at first it looks like they don't have much to show for it. Black definitely isn't getting some attack on the white king here, but black's idea is black's simply going to put a lot of pressure on the white queen side. After this pawn on a6 falls, black is going to have a semi-open b and a file here. This bishop is going to help out on this diagonal, and black's going to be able to put a lot of pressure on those pawns, and meanwhile, black's pawn structure is very compact. We see all the black pawns are going to be in one cohesive chain. After black plays d6, black really has no weaknesses, and black's hoping that this will compensate them for being down a pawn. So I pulled a sample game here. This is a game that was played back in the 70s, that really illustrates a lot of black's ideas here in the Benko Gambit. So let's go ahead and take a look. White can continue development with knight to c3. Black goes ahead and grabs that pawn back with bishop takes a6. And now one of white's main moves here is e4, just grabbing more space in the center and defending this pawn. Of course, one downside is that after bishop takes f1, the white king cannot castle. That's another piece of compensation black's getting for his pawn sacrifice. King takes f1 and d6, just making sure that white can't play an early e5. Knight to f3, bishop g7, and now h3. White will sometimes choose to play h3 and put the king on h2 to get it out of the way. Sometimes white will also choose to play g3 here and put the king directly on g2, which is quicker, but some would argue that h3 is less weakening. One of the advantages of h3 is it stops some maneuver like knight to g4 and knight to e5, when black's going to have really good control on those dark squares. So h3 was chosen in this game. Black goes ahead and gets castled, king to g1, knight b to d7, king h2. That king's finally out of the way, but that gave black a couple key development tempos, and now queen to a5. Now that black's finished up their development, they're finally ready to start putting pressure on these open b and a files against these white pawns on the queen side. So rook f to e1, and now rook f to b8. Currently this bishop can't move because the b2 pawn's under attack, so white chose to play queen c2 here, and now black played knight b6. This is a common maneuver in the Benko Gambit, especially when this knight g4, knight e5 idea doesn't work. This knight's going to reroute to the d7 square, so the other knight gets out of its way, comes to b6, and possibly this knight can add to the pressure on this b2 pawn by playing a later knight to c4. This also slows white down for the time being from playing e5 and breaking through in the center, because this d5 pawn would now be hanging. Knight to d2. And now black plays knight f to d7, making sure they have good control here of the e5 square. White begins their kingside operations by playing f4 here, and now c4, giving this knight access to the c5 square. Despite being down a pawn, black is already considered to be fully equal here, if not even slightly better. Their pieces are just so well coordinated. After knight to c5, really all of their pieces are coordinating so well to put pressure on the white queen side. And meanwhile, it's not so easy for white to find a plan here. Playing e5 is always going to be a little difficult. Black has a lot of good control of this square. Also, white's queenside pieces are really tied up. So in the game, white chose to play rook e3, just lifting that rook. Knight to c5, knight e2, trying to attack this c4 pawn by unleashing the queen. Queen b5 to defend that pawn. And this is looking very good for black. We could imagine possibly knight a4 being played soon, when there's all kinds of attackers here on the b2 pawn. Knight d3 could even be an idea at some point. In the game, white played a3, and black chose to play knight d3. And the white tried to solve their problems tactically here by removing the defender of this knight, but with how active the black pieces were, it didn't work too well. White played knight c3, queen a6, And now this tactical blow, knight takes c4, winning that pawn, and after black takes the piece, then white gets a piece back. But now there's this blow, knight takes b2, really unleashing this bishop here on g7 along the diagonal, and also pointing out that this queen is overworked, because after bishop takes b2, there would be rook takes b2, and if the queen took that rook, then the rook on d3 would be hanging. So after knight takes b2, white tried rook f3 to get that rook out of the way, but now knight a4, really exploiting this diagonal even more. The game continued e5, d takes e5, f takes e5, bishop takes e5. White tried this blow, bishop f4, hoping they could make use of the rook here on b8 being able to be taken after the c3 knight falls. But after bishop takes c3, rook takes c3, knight takes c3, bishop takes b8, knight takes d5, black obtained a nearly winning position. Now black's the one who's up a pawn, and this a3 pawn still remains a target. Going back to our starting position here, let's show one more example of the Benko Gambit accepted, this time with a different setup from white. And in this game, white succeeded in fending off black's pressure and maintaining their extra pawn. This is a game from 2006, and the white player was around 2,500 and the black player was around 2,300. So in this game, white chose this setup with g3, and this setup doesn't expand in the center for white as quickly as knight c3 and e4 does, but it also avoids having your king have to come to f1 after black plays bishop takes f1 after the e-pawn moves. So d6, bishop g2, bishop takes a6, knight c3, bishop g7, all very normal developing moves, knight f3, knight b to d7, and now rook b1. White's beginning to try to organize a defense of their pawns on the queen side so they can get a comfortable setup without having their pieces tied up. Castle, castle, queen a5. We've seen this idea before. Black simply develops the queen out here to the a5 square, making room for this rook to come to the b8 square and maximize the pressure against the queenside pawns. But now bishop d2, eyeing this queen, rook f to b8, queen c2, and now that black's kind of got their ideal setup, they choose to play this knight g4, knight e5 maneuver that we talked about, just really securing their grip on those dark squares, and they kind of have a superfluous knight here. These two knights are kind of fighting for the same squares, and black decides to possibly exchange one knight off for this strong knight on f3. b3, knight g to e5, white goes ahead and exchanges knights, and now plays a4. This was kind of the ideal setup white was looking for when they played rook to b1. Now there's no more pressure on the a-pawn, all the pressure is going to be on the backwards b-pawn, but white's hoping they can just play knight a2 and b4, and hopefully just remain up a pawn. And that's what happened in the game. Black played queen to d8, getting out of the way of this bishop on d2, and now rook f to e1. Black played rook a7, hoping to double on the b-file and pressure this b-pawn, since it's really the only target remaining. But after knight to a2, rook a to b7, and b4, white gets to exchange off that weak pawn, and white's done a really good job of neutralizing all the black threats. Black's two bishops remain on really open diagonals here, but there's really nothing on those diagonals. White just played the calm rook to e1 to defend that e-pawn. White's gotten everything out of the way of the dark squared bishop, and in this position, white is actually threatening to play, white's threatening to play b5 here and get connected past pawns. So in the game, black had to exchange off pawns there on b4. White was able to just recapture. And this a-pawn is still isolated, so black might have a target to aim at least. But it's becoming clear that black does not have enough compensation here for the pawn, and white is comfortably up a pawn. Alright, we've looked at two good examples there from the Benko Gambit accepted. Let's see what happens if white declines the Benko Gambit. One way to do this is to play c takes b5, and after a6, there's this move b6 called the pawn return variation. White's simply giving that pawn back and making sure that black will not have access to the open a file here by keeping this file closed. At first it looks a bit silly to take this pawn and then give it right back, but the following sample line really illustrates what white's looking for here. So black can play d6. Again, there's no real rush to take this pawn. White's going to play in a similar way to what we've already seen, playing knight c3 and e4, but again, without a bishop coming to a6, white's not going to have to worry about bishop takes f1. So instead, queen takes b6, black grabs that pawn right back, e4, g6, knight f3, bishop g7, all normal developing moves we've seen before. And now white plays knight d2, and we really see their idea here that by taking on b5 and then playing b6, white has secured this c4 outpost for this knight. This knight's going to be very strong here on c4. Some games, for example, have continued castles, bishop e2, knight b to d7, white just calmly gets castled, and now after rook b8, knight c4, white stands better in this position. We're kind of back to some normal Benoni defense ideas. Black has the semi-open b file here, White might try to play in the center with their space advantage, maybe by playing f4 and a later e5. No one's down a pawn yet, but the white pieces have found some pretty good squares. Finally, just one more example line of the Benko Gambit decline. We looked at white taking on b5 and giving the pawn back with b6. White can also just play knight f3, even allowing black to take here on c4 if black wants to. White's not really concerned about that because that pawn on c4 would be really hard to defend. Black usually plays g6, and black's not worried about white changing their mind and taking there. That would just transpose back to the Benko Gambit accepted. Queen c2. Black now takes on c4, but white doesn't take back with their queen. There's no reason to expose the queen like that. White can just play e4 and take back with the bishop next turn and develop that piece. d6, bishop takes c4, bishop g7, castle, castle, knight c3. Black can play bishop a6 and exchange off that bishop for white's powerful bishop here on c4. And after bishop takes a6, knight takes a6, queen to e2, queen b6. The position's roughly equal here. Again, black's going to be getting pressure here on the b file, and white has this central pawn majority here and some more space in the center. If white were to play knight d2 here, trying this similar idea of bringing this knight to the c4 outpost, which looks very logical, one of black's nice ideas here is to play knight to c7, really eyeing this d-pawn to make e5 harder to achieve, because that d-pawn would be hanging, and if white continued knight c4, then the queen actually stands pretty well here on a6, pinning this knight to the queen for the time being, and black can put a rook on the b-file in the near future. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed learning about the Benko Gambit today. Please make sure you visit chesspathways.com. I'll put a link down in the description and get signed up there. Totally free, only takes 5 seconds, and I will send you a free move-by-move guide to chess thinking when you join. I look forward to sending you more free and exclusive content in the future, so I will see you there. Thanks!